we are back with our second segment. I will speak to you about the cargo business and the airport segment of the aviation industry. For those who have joined us late or didn't see the first episode, I have with me Gudrun Teloeken, who has several years of experience in the aviation industry. She's worked with the Lima Airport, the Peru Airport. She was instrumental in Fraport's investment in the Delhi Airport. She currently is serving as the co-managing director of the St. Petersburg Airport, and she's also the chief financial officer of the St. Petersburg Airport. So welcome again, Gudrun. Gudrun, as I was telling you, when we were discussing about the airlines, that the cargo piece of the whole aviation industry has interested me, and it's been a topic of curiosity for me in the past year. The cargo revenues are expected to reach 152 billion in 2021, which is up from 128 billion in 2020 and 101 billion in 2019. It means that the cargo segment will account for 1/3 of the revenues of the aviation industry in 2021. In your experience, again, as the CFO and as a co-managing director of an airport, what has driven this demand?
We have to differentiate between the value that you're mentioning. That is, of course, a dramatic increase even last year over the year before. And this year is also expected to be a very good year for cargo.
Yeah.
But when we look at volumes, there has been a decline last year for a simple reason. Half of the world's air cargo is roughly half of the world's air cargo is transported by belly freight. Forwarders, they are dependent on empty bellies of mainly long-haul aircraft. And only 50% is flown by dedicated freighters. So you can imagine that last year, with passenger traffic coming down to zero for a while on the international scale, in spring last year, all that capacity fell away completely. So for a while, global capacity just dropped by 50%, to put it in very simple terms. What some of the airlines who are in both segments, dedicated cargo and passenger, with passengers always mixed, there's always a little cargo as a byproduct in the picture. So some of them have converted passenger airplanes to cargo airplanes in order to cater to the demand that had been not on the levels of 2019 or 2018, had been a very good year for air cargo. But of course, it did not decline as much as the passenger traffic declined. The main driver for that, or one of the main drivers, was the medical equipment. You remember all those discussions here in Europe. The press has been covering that for days and weeks, the lack of masks and other protection gear for intensive care unit teams in hospitals.
And this year it was for India was concentrators. A lot of concentrators were imported by way of air freight. Oxygen concentrators were in short supply.
Yeah. So medical equipment is, of course, in a pandemic time, that would be your first guess also, but that has been a very important driver that went against a further drop in demand for cargo last year. Also, what we've seen, although the statistics could be interpreted in different ways, but of course, the lack of other ways of transportation, with the containers being a short supply in some harbors, and also supplies for spare parts and things like that, with China being the global factory of the world, and the supply by sea having been interrupted. So also when there is a shortage of certain vital components, even if they usually do not meet the value threshold for being transported by air, because it's very important and very expensive to transport cargo by air. So, but even these components might have been increased the demand for cargo capacity. And that's why it has remained strong. And of course, the rule is that the scarcer the space, the capacity, the higher the price is. And this is why the value has been so dramatically high of the total volumes.
So you think that's the reason. It's not because the volume of cargo has increased, but the kind of cargo that is being shipped and
Yes.
the price that is being charged for the cargo. So the kind of cargo that is being shipped is really, again, sort of in some cases, high value cargo. For instance, a certain type of medical equipment, like we spoke about oxygen concentrators, electronic equipment. And this coupled with the shortage in capacity is what is contributed to the growth in revenues. That's my understanding of what you've just said. My next question is, let's suppose, the world is able to control this virus in near time, and this whole impetus, if you can call it, to the cargo segment of, shipping of medical equipment and the like, which has sustained itself during the pandemic, that need goes away. Do you think, are you saying that the cargo revenues will fall, or do you think they'll sort of plateau out? Do you think habits have changed and people will use air freight more? Manufacturers are finding it easier, or you think that it'll probably be what it was pre-pandemic in terms of the cargo revenue contribution to the whole industry?
This will go back to pre-crisis levels because the cargo business is very volatile. You can always, when you work in airports, what you look at when you want to know where the overall economic development goes, the first thing you look at is cargo, because it's usually an early indicator of how an economy is developing in some part of the world, because the demand for cargo short-term is driven by supply shortage, your warehouses and all that, when there is a lot of demand, when your order books are full. So it can even happen that very low value merchandise like textiles are flown by air when there is a very hot summer. We have seen that in the past years, and then one of the big textile traders, they run out of supplies for summer dresses or something. Even then it can be worthwhile to book spare capacity in the belly of a plane. And the rates for that, they fluctuate on a daily basis. There are platforms, that is a rather new trend, that you do not call your forwarder, FedEx or whoever you call them, and then they take care of everything, but you can check on a platform and book the whole journey of your merchandise from door to door. This is new. The impact of that might not really be that there is a dramatic increase in air cargo, but only that the spare capacity is used in a more efficient way. Because the load factors in cargo, they are roughly around 60% of available capacity. But whether that can go much higher, sometimes sometimes it's used at 100%, other times only at 30, but this is applicable for the belly capacity, because that is more or less opportunistic.
So your view is really the cargo business is driven by the belly capacity. So my next question to you is actually contrarian to that concept. What the pandemic did was, one business which has grown by leaps and bounds during the pandemic is the e-commerce business. And of course, everyone knows that, the logistic hubs are required by the e-commerce business for transporting goods quickly. And we've seen the growth of hubs even in the sea freight business. Do you think that is likely to happen in the aviation industries, where at the back of the e-commerce growth, you have creation of cargo hubs? So there are dedicated cargo hubs being created around the world.
I do not believe that will happen for the simple reason that the existing dedicated cargo airports that you find in geographically prominent positions, let's say. For example, you remember that the biggest airport over a certain month last year had been an airport in Anchorage in Alaska. The biggest airport by a number of air traffic movements, ATMs, and that was really strange and nobody would have ever guessed it. That was because it had been used for transporting cargo from, Asia to the rest of the Americas. The specifics about dedicated cargo hubs is that they are more or less a cost center for the forwarders, for the global, transportation industry and freight industry. So in order to keep costs down, and it is expensive to ship cargo by air, in order to keep the costs down, one aspect we have just discussed, that is to use existing capacity in the bellies. And these airplanes will use existing passenger hubs. So what you see is that many of the global passenger transfer hubs are also very big cargo hubs. So the infrastructure also for this e-commerce that you mentioned, which is, of course, that is a trend that has been strengthened by the COVID crisis. The inner cities sort of die, the retail business there goes away. And that is a trend that had been there even before the crisis. Only the crisis sort of is an enhancer of these trends that you find anyway. But I think that the existing cargo hubs will grow further and there will be more incremental cargo handling capacity. Also, the rest of the journey, like switching to the train, switching to the I was going to say bus, no, of course, to the lorry in order to be transported to the door, to the recipient. That is something that is a logistic, can be a nightmare, but this is something that has improved dramatically over the past years. You have these in-day deliveries, depending on where you order something, or sometimes overnight deliveries. And there, I'm sure that also the air cargo will play an important role, but mainly belly.
Thanks, Gudrun. That brings us to the end of the cargo segment, and we'll move to the discussion on the airports. I have a few questions that I want to put to you on the airports themselves. So, Gudrun, the COVID crisis has pretty much brought the airports around the world, at the peak of the crisis, to a halt. The reason I understand is because the ability of the airports to mitigate their losses is limited because of the fixed cost base that the airports have. And every passenger lost by an airline is also a passenger lost by an airport. Looking at the numbers, it is predicted that global airports experienced revenue reductions of 65%, totaling to 111.8 billion. In Europe, airports had a revenue shortfall of 40.8 billion. While Middle East, the revenues fell by 73.5%. What have the airports done to stay afloat during this time?
In most countries, the airports have received support from their governments in the form of debt, form even of equity injections, forgiveness of existing debt, and also tax holidays in some countries have been granted, and a big support to manage the cash burn rate in a less negative way has been provided by the governments. That's one set of measures. The second is that most airports have made high percentages of staff redundant, just like airlines also have done that. So in countries like Germany, for example, you have the opportunity to use money from the state to keep your employees on your payroll, but the state takes like 80% of the salary costs while the employees stay at home. And so airports in Germany have used that option. That has been also available in some other countries in a similar scheme. So cutting costs, especially employees, cutting costs by reducing maintenance to a vital minimum necessary, closing parts of terminals or closing full terminals. Frankfurt, for example, they have closed Terminal 2 completely and just used one area of Terminal 1 because they only had to manage 17 million passengers as opposed to 70 million. So that you do not need all the areas. Of course, you need to heat the infrastructure or you need to cool it depending on where you are. You need to clean it. You need to do certain things. You cannot just give it up. As you say, it's the figures usually make up 70 or more % of an airport's costs. And making staff redundant also is tricky sometimes because you do not know when traffic will recover and you cannot go to the minimum that you need at that time because you have like 1 or 2 months that you need to prepare the recruitment cycle, the training, the security clearance, the checks, and all that. So also you can consider part of the headcount as fixed, if you like, or semi-fixed, because for the next 2-3 million, you need X staff more. So this has been an extreme challenge. Other than airlines, they can just ground aircraft, but also airlines, of course, have a much higher headcount as compared to airports. So for them also making staff redundant on a temporary basis and for good has been a similar pattern for both industries, airlines and airports.
So again, another interesting data point that I came across was that in 2021, the Airport Council International took out a list of the 10 busiest airports. And of this list of 10, 6 are in China and 4 in the US. So, coming back to what we had initially discussed, that the domestic traffic has played a significant role in this last 1.5 years. So clearly, in some ways, you can even say that the domestic passenger, which was in many ways treated like a second-class citizen, has regained the importance. So do you think that the air, because the lounges, everything is so different when you look at the international passenger facility and you look at the domestic passenger facility, do you think that the airports will, because it's not so true in India where in one city you literally have one airport and there's not so much of competition between airports, but it is there in other parts of the world. Do you think airports will invest more to cater to domestic passengers now, or it really is of no consequence?
Well, you're asking that question of a finance person at an airport, and you have to keep in mind that, of course, the domestic markets have been the robust backbone of the big markets that we have talked about. They have kept many airports afloat and have helped to survive the crisis much better than airports that usually cater to huge international traffic shares. But you need to keep in mind that the tariff regulation in most countries foresees a much lower airport charge for a domestic passenger than for an international passenger. Also, you have the duty-free regimes in most countries. And so that let's just put it in terms like the purchasing power of an international passenger, or maybe it's not the purchasing power, it's the spend and the yield that an airport can raise with an international passenger. In some countries, it ranges from 1.5 to up to 4 or 5 times of a domestic passenger. And clearly, in the big markets, you always have the phenomenon that you do not have only airports like Indira Gandhi in Delhi or, in the big cities, where you have affluent domestic business travelers that, of course, you can invest for. You can make a nicer lounge. You can create another high-end restaurant, all these things. But in smaller airports, where the airports are vital to connect a remote area, for example, to the rest of the country's network, that is also a vital interest of a government to keep those charges low. From the airport perspective, of course, you would like to have higher charges, but the investment that an airport can do always is reflecting the, let's say, the economic value behind that specific traffic segment that you cater to. So I'm afraid, no, there will not be so much more investment in the domestic lounges.
I shouldn't have asked this question to a finance person, my bad. So, you may be aware that India is planning to have 100 new airports, connecting several of the smaller cities, including several cities in the Northeast. So, a lot of India is underserved as far as airports is concerned, but I really, don't see how quickly it will happen, given that the pandemic has really thrown a spanner in the works for a lot of the developmental work within India. This is my last question. This is really related to the environmental issues. The Gen X, Y, Z, millennials, whatever it is that you call them, are increasingly becoming more and more conscious. And not only them, a lot of the world is becoming very, very conscious about environmental issues. And there's this whole concept of flight shaming that happens, right? And in India, traditionally, of course, people, even for very long drives, even 12-hour drives, people take their cars and go because it's just cheaper for a family to just sit in the car and go as compared to taking a flight. But in a city, in a area or geographical area like the European Union or Europe, where most of the cities are driving distance, right? Do you think that this concept of flight shaming arising out of environmental issues would start encouraging more and more people to drive to various cities within Europe? Because most of the cities, whereas in India, even if you're traveling from Delhi to Jaipur, which is 260 odd kilometers, it takes you, it could take you 5 to 6 hours to get there. Given the state of the roads, etc., in Europe, you could pretty much get from one city to the other within 3 to 4 hours, even if you took your own car. So the question is that, do you see that this trend will change people's habit of taking these very short flights that people take in Europe? Number one. And number two question is that, are there significant environmental, are you aware? And I know I don't want to put you in a spot because it's probably for an environmentalist and not for a finance person. But are there significant environmental benefits of taking a drive, taking a train or a car, if you were in Europe, versus taking a flight?
The question is rather complex, not easy to answer in one line. So definitely it is always environmentally more friendly to use the train or the car than the plane. That's for sure. Of course, the aviation sector has a right of existence and is needed in many parts of the world and is the only viable means of transportation in many parts of the world. As you correctly say, it's a trade-off between time invested in driving and flying. And switching city connections in Europe from the air to the train is, of course, something that has been done for many years. But you still can fly from Frankfurt to Munich or to Hamburg, or to Paris even. You can fly while there are trains in place, fast-speed trains that bring you from Frankfurt to Paris in 4 hours only, for example. I've tested it, it works well. So with increasingly fast train connections, sometimes it's not even necessary or even more convenient to take the train. And even the European airlines have now committed to reduce the domestic flights within France and Germany have made commitments in that respect. But and that is environmentally more friendly, definitely. But we should not forget that when you cannot fly from, let's say, Marseille to Paris, to take a train, to take a plane to fly to Delhi. But you need to go to Delhi from Marseille. There is no direct flight. What do? You either take the train, go to Paris, and then you switch to the plane, multimodal or intermodal mode of transport, it's called. And it has been tested, but the other option would be to take a flight to the Middle East and fly from there to Delhi. So what happens in the end is that basically an international flight is lost for the French or whichever airline would take the person from Paris to Delhi, Air India or Air France, I don't know. And so that is lost, and the related value or income is lost for the French economy, to put it like that. So the effect is that there is a deviation of the current global flight patterns that we see, the first step of which we already have seen more than 10 years ago, when much of the world's transfer traffic has shifted to the Middle East. Now, with the new big airport in Istanbul, some of that might be drawn back to Istanbul, to a European Asian spot. And but the effect is not really what you wish for. You do not really cancel those carbon emissions related to such a flight. You just it's just exported, if you like. Of course, you can count that maybe you do not fly up to Paris first, and then you fly east. You fly directly, and you stop once. But altogether, it's like siphoning the markets of those countries who commit to not allow short-haul flights. Because what is important is that a transfer traffic lives off feeder flights. You need feeders in order to fill your long-haul wide-body capacity. And this might fall away. And so I leave the question open here, or the answer, for everybody to think about it, but it's not really the solution. So the solution needs to be more on an international scale, and a joint effort of the industry to check what can be done to reduce the emissions. ATC alignment, different new technologies, that's more for the airline segment, new fuels, more efficient aircraft. All these things have to be more in the focus. Of course, the trains and this intermodal mode of transport is important as one mosaic of the whole picture, but that alone will not help reduce the carbon emissions of this sector dramatically.
So thank you so much, Gudrun. Thank you for your time. It's such a pleasure to, at least be able to see you and chat with you. And I hope to see you. I hope to be able to take a flight soon, an international flight soon. You take care. And thank you so much again for your time and your insights. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Shivpriya. Bye. Take care.